A radio broadcasts warnings from the future. The thrift store felt like a place forgotten by time, tucked in a corner of the city that nobody cared about. The air inside was musty, thick with the scent of old books, worn leather, and dust. The storm outside painted streaks of rain across the grimy windows, casting shifting shadows onto the cluttered shelves. I hadn't planned to stop in, but something about the flickering neon "open" sign in the window compelled me. The store owner, an old man with hollow eyes and a perpetual scowl, barely glanced at me when I walked in. I wandered through aisles of cracked porcelain, faded paintings, and shelves groaning under the weight of forgotten trinkets. Nothing stood out until I reached the far corner of the store, where the dim light seemed to fail altogether. That's when I saw it. The radio. It sat on a dusty wooden table, its sleek black frame polished but oddly pristine, like it didn't belong among the junk surrounding it. The dials gleamed faintly under the weak light, and the brass knobs reflected a warped image of my face. It was beautiful in its simplicity, almost magnetic. I could have walked away, and I probably should have. But as I reached out to touch it, the faint hum of static drifted from its speakers. The noise startled me. The radio wasn't plugged in. Interested. The grating voice of the shopkeeper broke the spell, and I turned to find him standing uncomfortably close, his bony hands clasped together. His gaze flicked from me to the radio, his lips curling into a small, humorless smile. "Does it work?" I asked, my voice a little too loud in the quiet store. He shrugged. "It works when it wants to. Old things like that, they have their quirks." I hesitated. There was something unsettling about the way he looked at the radio, almost reverent, like it was something sacred, or cursed. Still, I couldn't resist. "How much?" He named a price so low it felt wrong, but I didn't argue. Minutes later, I was trudging home with the radio wrapped in a tattered paper bag, the storm soaking through my jacket. As soon as I set it on my desk, the static began again. The sound was faint, almost soothing, like white noise meant to lull you to sleep. I fiddled with the knobs, expecting to hear old music or muffled voices, but all I got was the hiss of static, rising and falling like a breath. Then, just as I was about to give up, a voice crackled through. "Breaking news tonight. A fire has engulfed the west end of the garment district. Emergency responders are en route." The voice was clear, authoritative, like a seasoned newscaster. I frowned, confused. I hadn't thought the radio was actually functional. I left it playing in the background as I went about my night. An hour later, a notification buzzed on my phone. "Breaking! Fire in garment district leaves 2 dead." I stared at the screen, my stomach twisting into a knot. The radio had mentioned the fire before the news app. That was impossible, wasn't it? I didn't sleep that night. The next night, the radio came to life again. I had avoided turning it on all day, but as soon as the sun dipped below the horizon, the static returned. This time, the voice that emerged was frantic, nearly drowned out by the crackle of interference. "Train derailment. Multiple injuries reported. Avoid. Main crossing." I froze, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. My stomach churned with unease, but I couldn't look away. It was just a coincidence, I told myself. Radios pick up signals all the time. I repeated this mantra until it felt hollow. But the next morning, the news was plastered everywhere. A commuter train had derailed near the crossing on Main Street. Casualties were reported, just as the voice had warned. Over the next few days, the broadcasts became more frequent. Each one detailed an event that hadn't happened yet. A thunderstorm that would flood parts of the city, a gas leak in a crowded apartment complex, a missing child found wandering on the highway. Each time, I checked the news hours later and saw the same grim headlines staring back at me. The predictions weren't just accurate, they were prophetic. I tried to ignore it, bury myself in schoolwork and distractions. But every evening, the static lured me back, the whispers calling me like a siren song. It wasn't until the 7th night that the broadcast turned personal. The voice came through loud and clear this time, calm but cold, its words freezing me in place. Local resident Alex Harper found dead at 8:43 p.m. Victim suffered fatal injuries in a hit and run. I stared at the radio, my pulse pounding in my ears. My name, my death. The room felt suddenly claustrophobic, the walls closing in around me. The clock on my desk read 6:30. The broadcast hadn't just predicted the event, it had given me a countdown. I reached for the power switch, my fingers trembling, and turned the radio off. The static vanished, replaced by an oppressive silence that felt even worse. For hours I paced the room, my mind racing. Was it a sick joke? Some kind of elaborate prank? But the memories of the past week burned in my mind, undeniable proof that the radio was no ordinary device. At 8:15, the radio switched on by itself. The static roared to life, and the voice spoke again, emotionless as ever. 28 minutes remain. I couldn't breathe. My time was running out. By 8:20, I was no longer pacing. I was running. My breath came in shallow gasps, my heart hammering like a trapped bird. The radio's countdown ticked away in my head, relentless and steady. 23 minutes. 22. Each second felt like a noose tightening around my neck. I shoved the radio into my closet and slammed the door shut. For good measure, I dragged a chair in front of the door, as if that would somehow keep it contained. But even through the wood, I could hear it. Not static, not a voice, just a faint hum, low and insistent, like a heartbeat out of sync with my own. I grabbed my phone, fingers fumbling as I searched for an explanation. There had to be something, anything, to rationalize what was happening. Ghost frequencies, interference, pranks. But no search result made sense. How could a device predict events, let alone my own death? The screen blurred as tears welled up in my eyes. For the first time, it truly hit me. I might die tonight. Not in the vague, abstract way you think about mortality, but a visceral, immediate terror. I'd always thought I had more time. The clock on my phone read 8:30. 17 minutes left. The radio's hum grew louder, resonating through the house like a swarm of invisible bees. I pressed my hands over my ears and stumbled toward the door. I had to leave. If the broadcast was right, if I was going to die at a specific time and place, then I just needed to avoid that place. Stay away from the streets. Hide. But the moment I stepped outside, the wind carried a sound that froze me in my tracks. The static. It wasn't coming from the radio anymore. It was everywhere, riding on the cold night air, mingling with the faint rustle of leaves. I turned back toward the house, but the static followed, whispering at the edges of my hearing. 16 minutes. Avoid running. I stopped dead, my heart leaping into my throat. The voice wasn't coming from the radio now. It was inside my head. I stumbled backward, my breath hitching. My vision blurred, the world tilting on its axis. My phone buzzed, startling me. A text lit up the screen. Unknown number. You can't outrun it. I nearly dropped the phone. My pulse hammered in my ears as I stared at the words. How? Who was doing this? My fingers moved of their own accord, typing a frantic reply. Who is this? No response. The static grew louder, drowning out my thoughts. Shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally in the dim light of the street lamps, clawing at the edges of my vision. The air turned cold. the kind of chill that burrows under your skin and roots itself in your bones. 11 minutes. The voice was steady, cold, and absolute. My legs gave out and I sank to the curb, shaking. There was no escape, no way to stop the countdown. It wasn't just predicting my death, it was orchestrating it. The world around me was no longer real. The streets, the houses, the dim orange glow of the streetlights, they all seemed distant, blurred by the suffocating haze of fear. The static in my head grew louder, a deafening crescendo that seemed to sync with my heartbeat. 9 minutes. Run! The voice wasn't guiding me. It was taunting me. I stumbled to my feet, adrenaline propelling me forward even as my vision swam. The streets were deserted, but I felt watched, as though unseen eyes tracked my every move. My phone buzzed again, but I didn't dare look. I didn't need another message to confirm what I already knew. I couldn't escape. As I rounded a corner, the shadows shifted. At first I thought it was just a trick of the light, but then I saw it. A figure standing at the far end of the street. It was barely visible in the gloom, an outline more than a person, its shape flickering like an old film reel. I froze, my breath catching. The static in my head roared, drowning out everything else. The figure didn't move, but its presence was suffocating, its shape wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. It was like looking at something that didn't belong in this world. 7 minutes. The voice rasped directly in my ear now, as if the figure was speaking to me. I took a step back, then another, but the figure remained motionless. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body refused to obey. Then the figure moved. Not walking, not running, just a sudden shift, like it had blinked forward. 1 second, it was 20 feet away. The next, it was 10. I stumbled back, my chest tightening as panic clawed at me. "Stay away!" I screamed, my voice cracking. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it extended an arm, pointing down the street toward a dark intersection, toward where the voice said I would die. 5 minutes. The air felt heavier now, each breath a struggle. My legs finally obeyed, and I turned and ran, not caring where I went as long as it was away. My feet pounded against the pavement, the static following me like a relentless tide. But no matter where I went, the streets all seemed to loop back to the same place, the dark intersection. The figure was always there, waiting, its form flickering like a glitch in reality. 3 minutes. Tears streamed down my face as I stumbled to a halt. The street was empty now, save for the intersection ahead. The figure was gone, but I felt its presence, heavy and oppressive. The radio's voice filled my mind one last time. 2 minutes. Face it. I stepped forward, my body trembling. The streetlights flickered and died, plunging me into darkness. The static stopped. And then, I heard the sound of tires screeching. The screech of tires pierced the suffocating darkness, sharp and visceral. My body tensed, frozen in place, as though the world had momentarily stuttered. Time seemed to fragment. Seconds stretched into infinity. The air around me charged with static so intense it felt like needles pricking my skin. A blinding flash of headlights erupted from the void, racing toward me. Instinct screamed for me to move, but my legs were leaden, rooted to the cold asphalt. My mind replayed the radio's warning like a sinister chant. 8:43 p.m., fatal injuries, hit and run. The car roared closer, its hulking shape wrong, its edges distorted, flickering like the shadowy figure I'd seen earlier. The headlights weren't just bright, they burned, casting long skeletal shadows that stretched and writhed like living things. My breath hitched as I glimpsed the driver, or what should have been the driver. There was no one behind the wheel. The car barreled toward me. but just as I braced for the impact, it vanished. The sound, the lights, the crushing sense of inevitability, all gone. I was alone in the intersection, shivering in the oppressive silence that followed. My knees buckled, and I collapsed to the ground, my pulse roaring in my ears. It was over, or so I thought. The static returned, softer this time, like a whisper curling around the edges of my mind. My head snapped up, and I saw it. The radio. It sat in the middle of the street, pristine and untouched, as though it had been waiting for me all along. The brass dials gleamed under the flickering light of a lone street lamp, and its speakers emitted a low hum, rhythmic and pulsing. I should have run. I should have screamed. But something compelled me to crawl closer, drawn by a force I couldn't resist. My shaking hands reached for the radio, and the moment my fingers brushed its cold surface, the voice spoke again. You survived." The words sent a shiver through me, not relief, but dread. The voice wasn't congratulatory, it was accusatory, almost disappointed. I tried to pull my hand away, but I couldn't. My fingers felt fused to the radio, as though it had become an extension of me. The static shifted, warping into faint voices overlapping in a cacophony of anguish. They weren't just random sounds, they were cries, pleads, warnings. "Turn back. You can't escape. It knows you." My head spun, the dissonant voices tangling with my thoughts. Images flickered behind my eyes, shadowy figures screaming in agony, endless highways looping back on themselves, clocks spinning wildly out of sync. Each vision clawed at my sanity, and I felt myself unraveling. The voice returned, louder now, its tone dark and final. "Your time is borrowed. Another must take your place." "No," I screamed, clawing at the radio. "I didn't ask for this. I didn't." The radio buzzed violently, a high-pitched whine that drowned out my protests. My body convulsed, and for a moment, the world seemed to collapse inward. I felt weightless, suspended in a void where time didn't exist. Then, with a sickening jolt, I was back in the thrift store. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sterile glow on the cluttered shelves. The storm outside was gone, replaced by an eerie stillness. I blinked, disoriented, as the familiar scent of dust and decay filled my nostrils. The radio sat on the table in front of me, untouched, its black frame gleaming. But something was different now. The shopkeeper stood behind the counter, watching me with an expression I couldn't read, part pity, part knowing. "Did you hear it?" he asked softly, his voice cutting through the haze in my mind. I opened my mouth to answer, but no sound came out. My hands trembled as I backed away from the table, my heart pounding with the realization that I wasn't the same person who had entered the store hours or lifetimes ago. The shopkeeper smiled faintly, his gaze shifting to the radio. "It's ready for the next listener." I turned and fled, the bell above the door jingling hollowly as I stumbled into the night. The air outside was cold and sharp, but I barely felt it. My thoughts churned with a single, horrifying certainty. The radio wasn't just a device, it was a cycle, a trap. And I had survived by passing the curse to someone else, someone who would walk into that store, drawn by the same inexplicable pull, and pick up where I left off. As I walked away, the static whispered faintly behind me, growing fainter with each step, but never truly fading. I didn't look back. I couldn't.